make a few comments. The film you are about to see narrates my life-changing experience and reflections during my early teens in my native country, Hungary. It lays bare the pathologies of a toxic creed and culture that defined our lives and our tragic fate. It's through these lenses that we have often judged and viewed the world as an immoral adjudicator of Jewish people endlessly on the siege. The Bremen Museum commissioned the production of my testimony as educational document and a cautionary tale for future generations. Lest we forget, the seeds of the Holocaust were planted 1,800 years ago. Toxic cultural doctrines and dogmas sullied our heritage and sullied our reputation. Inflammatory rhetoric and mocking language chipped away at our heritage year after year, generation after generation, demonizing us as a godless and corrupt faith. It simmered and boiled like an active volcano until it erupted and swallowed up over 6 million innocent lives, including my entire family and 3 younger brothers. It's a shameful legacy and an indictment of European humanism and far too many religious leaders. Instead of treating us as spiritual brothers, Jews became the enemy. My narrative will bring you face to face with our surreal horrors that could have been avoided if all the self-proclaimed righteous and God-fearing people took a collective and unified stand against Hitler's diabolical madness. But there was willful silence and willful blindness. The experience invites us to reflect on what that history teaches us and how that history should guide us on our path forward. We're ready for film.
And the video is narrated by former Mayor Andrew Young.
Yes, and by the way, the film, former ambassador, mayor of Atlanta, and Congressman Andrew Young. You are looking at a person who is a living testimony to the Holocaust.
At age 80, Murray Lynn might be expected to spend his days dwelling in the satisfied bliss of many accomplishments. Instead, for our sake, he intentionally relives nightmares almost too horrible for words.
I just want the audience to remember that Auschwitz was the kingdom of death, that it swallowed up the young and the old, the meek and the mighty, and the simple and the educated. And I hope that this kingdom of death that we experienced is immortalized for future generations so they will better understand why we must talk about this.
For 11 years, Adolf Hitler dedicated himself and his regime to destroying all of the Jews of Europe. He nearly succeeded, but one survivor said it is not accurate to place responsibility for the Holocaust on this lone villain, or even his army of Nazis. He said centuries of hate provided fertile ground for both the Third Reich and the Holocaust.
What happened when Hitler came to power? Hitler, in a way, pierced that facade of silence.
A facade of silence, a hate that lay so close to the surface of European society that when given voice and power, it erupted into unimaginable barbarism. lost everyone and everything to that hate, believes a facade of silence still lurks, luring us again to slumber. And so he has awakened his own voice to sound the warning.
As I got older, when I turned 70, I came to the realization that my life is not entirely my own. It belongs to tragic history. And from that, we need to draw some meaning, and we need to draw some direction, and we need to draw some lessons. But most of all, we want to send a message to the world for them to remember the consequences of silence, the consequences of hatred.
Every survivor of the Holocaust provides a unique and personal perspective. As you will learn, Murray Lynn survived not just a camp that slaughtered 1.5 million people, but a terrible trauma prior to his deportation to Auschwitz. But despite all the terror and loss he endured, Murray Lynn not only held on to his life, but also to his humanity.
We all have certain attributes, and I think the greatest attribute that I have is I cannot nurture hatred. All their clothes, their shoes, they had to dump them in one place, and then we were selected whether we're going to work or we're going to die.
He was about the age of these visitors when he entered Auschwitz. But whether Murray Lynn's personal story, or even the Holocaust itself, is within the grasp of every young mind is unlikely.
The survival rules were never to let the Germans know that you were sick, that you were incapable of performing the slave labor. If you are a fighter, you can overcome adversity. If you're not a fighter, you capitulate, and I was a fighter.
For most of his adult life, hardly anyone was aware of Murray Lynn's past. So his global business achievements, his enduring and happy marriage, his success as a father, while admired, may not have appeared that extraordinary, if only people had known. Even today, at 80 plus years, he remains a disciplined man with a brilliant mind and a unique charm. He just never offered explanations for why he avoided trains or large dogs. Given what we know about the treatment of Europe's Jews before and during World War II, it is hard to believe any survived. But in thousands of places, Jewish survival amidst vastly larger European Christian communities has historically been a profound challenge. And so it was for all the Jews in the Hungarian town of Bielki, including a young man known to friends as Maurice.
We were pretty much isolated from non-Jews. The Christian community did not want to have to do much with us. They did not. We were not integrated in the community. We knew the reasons why. It goes back 1,800 years. The church, for many, many years, had their doctrine was encapsulated in 4 words. Jews are unrepentant sinners. We were treated as infidels, as heretics, and they wanted very little to do with us. And this was a weekly sermon in a church that Jews killed Christ, that Jews were unrepentant sinners, and we must be treated accordingly as pariahs and isolated. Hating Jews being intolerant of Jews was part of the DNA of its culture and creed. And there is not very much we can do to change their mindset. So we lived almost in fear. We did not want to argue with these people because we knew it was a no-win game. And so we accepted our fate for many, many centuries as being the underclass.
Some elements of the Christian church did protest Nazi treatment of Jews and other minorities. Those efforts were brutally suppressed. More commonly, however, widespread church indifference and even support for the Nazi policies existed in many parts of Europe. So what began in the early 30s with vile propaganda evolved with shocking haste into isolation, brutalization, deportation, and the systematic slaughter of Europe's Jews. And again, while Hitler provided the face for these acts, tens of thousands willingly carried out his orders, while millions passively ignored unmistakable indications of the ongoing crimes.
Hitler emboldened those people. He encouraged them when they realized that they could speak freely because it came from other powers. It emboldened them to be more anti-Semitic, and it encouraged them to call us names. It encouraged them to taunt us. It encouraged them to mock us. It encouraged them to hate us. So things turned from being a passive, we had sort of a passive relationship, to a hostile relationship.
With Hitler in power, Nazi-like paramilitary groups formed or reformed across Europe. In Hungary, Arrow Cross, a murderous anti-Jewish group, had existed since the 15th century. When the Nazis began to ransack Europe, Hungary allied with Germany and thousands joined Arrow Cross, which in 1942 began targeting for death educated Jews like Murray's dad, Abe.
That was a turning point in our lives. That was the beginning of the end. I remember roughly at 2 or 3 in the morning, we had a knock on the door, and the 2 Arrow Cross fascists burst into our door, into our room, and they wanted to see my dad. We were all asleep. And when they told us, when they saw Dad, they told him to pack, to put his clothes on and pack his bags, whatever he wants to take with him, and follow them to an unknown destination. We were hysterical when this happened. We all wanted to know why Dad was taken, where Dad was being taken, and what the charges were. But they were unresponsive. My dad was an educator and a community leader. And what they did first is they decided to surround all educators and community leaders, to get rid of them first so the community remains leaderless. Dad was whisked away into silence, only to be broken by barking dogs and whining wolves. That's all I remember. 2 weeks later, we heard that Dad and roughly 15 other community leaders were marched to the Carpathian Mountains and forced to dig their own mass grave. And then they were all executed. This changed our lives forever. Suddenly, we became vulnerable and very insecure. My mom didn't know what to do next. She didn't know how we were going to survive.
And how did Murray's non-Jewish neighbors and classmates react to the executions?
My impression is that they were glad because we were outsiders. They told us that we did not belong there in that community. We were treated as strangers. And if they took away another Jew or killed another Jew, it was it was a relief to many of them because it's one Jew less left in the community. I don't believe, knowing the mindset of those people in those days, I don't believe they cared.
Murray's famously lovely mother, Regina, was suddenly very vulnerable. As the oldest of 4 sons, Murray tried to protect her. But just 13, he was no match for the armed fascist.
I've only spoken about this 2 or 3 times in 60 years because it's too painful and I have a difficult time facing it. We had another knock on the door and a narrow-cross fascist soldier burst into our house and demanded to go to bed with my mom. I resisted, and he took out a gun. And he says, if you don't stop it, he says, you'll be dead, and no one will care. My mom told me to stop it. And I did. Next thing I knew, I woke up at 6 or 7 in the morning. He was gone. My mom was never the same.
By the spring of 1944, the war had turned sharply against Germany, confident that they could safely rely on the full participation of our cross. The Nazis nevertheless went ahead with their plans to annihilate Hungary's 1 million Jews.
Roughly April 1944, early morning, knock on the door, and we were told to pack our bags and follow the Arrow Cross soldiers to the train station. Mom, I remember she pulled the sheets and blankets from our beds to put our belongings because we didn't have luggage in those days. Only the well-to-do had luggage. And we put pots and pans and bread and flour and whatever for subsistence. And I remember my mom tied all the baggage on our necks. It was a surreal scene that you only see in a movie. As we were trekking to the train station, it was an orchestrated scene on the street. Many of them are neighbors, many of them we knew because it was a small community. We never believed that there was so much anger and hate and contempt for us as we were trudging with our baggage and our bags. They were hurling epithets at us, spitting at us, throwing rocks at us as we were led to our doom. Nobody came to our assistance. There was no moral outcry in the community.
Murray, now 14, with every other Jew in his town, was sent to a nearby city and into a ghetto created to serve as the temporary holding area. A few days later, Murray, his mother, and 3 brothers were shoved into an airless cattle car. For 72 hours, the train crept toward the death camp just across Hungary's border with Poland, Auschwitz.
Unfathomable. People in the cattle cars were wailing and crying and praying for salvation. We had no food and no sanitation facilities. People had to relieve themselves in their clothes. There were no sanitation. For 3 days, we suffered this dehumanizing experience. The cattle car smelled like a sewage plant. It was unbearable. Many older people died. the sick people died. When we got to Auschwitz, I don't remember how many people we took out of the cattle car dead.
Oblivious, even aware of what Auschwitz was, most of Murray's group was designated for a same-day execution.
The door jerked open, and all of a sudden we were surrounded by the Sonderkommando, which were Jewish prisoners helping us unload, and they helped the Gestapo with various chores, and surrounded also by the Gestapo. And they started shouting at us in German to put the clothes in a certain area and to line up. The Sonderkommandos came up to the train and they took off many of those who couldn't walk, those who were too sick, or those who were too tired. The very first thing we saw were the smoke-belching chimneys and the smell of flesh, and we knew immediately that something is going on here, but we had no idea.
These are Auschwitz photos of Hungarian Jews taken in early May of 1944, the very week Murray and his entire community arrived. It seemed that even those who feared the worst tried to remain as calm as possible and to comfort the children.
The young kids were less affected. We were more resilient than the older people. We didn't think as far, as deep as some of the older people. Mom was very reassuring. She was very positive person. I remember she would tell us, don't worry, I'm behind you, I'm with you, everything's going to be all right, don't worry about it, we'll all make it. Let's pray to the heavens. And she gave us peace and solace to the very last moment.
The last moment Murray would ever share with his family occurred within minutes after the family staggered down from the cattle car.
We were immediately separated. My mom huddled around my three brothers. She was sent to one side and I was sent to the other side. The people, those capable of working, the younger guys under 30, under 35, were separated for work, for slave labor camp, and the rest of them were assigned. They were told that they were going to take a disinfectant bath. And I remember a Sonderkommando told me, tell him you are 16. I was 14, tell him you're 16. He knew something I didn't know. If I was 16, they would assign me to work. And all I remember, the only thing I remember, my mom was hysterical when they yanked me away from her, and she bid me a farewell. The last thing she said, I love you, son. I hope to see you again. And that was the last time I saw my mom and my three brothers. I was assigned a striped suit. My number was 83,000. And I asked one of the prisoners, would you by any chance know where my mom and three brothers went? And he paused for a minute or two and didn't know what to tell me, didn't know whether he should tell me or not. He asked me to come out of the barracks, says, come on out, I'll show you where they are. And for a moment I was relieved. He takes me out of the barrack and then points to the chimney. That's where they are. This was roughly an hour after we were separated. This is how swiftly death came to these people. I said to myself, I'm alone. I have no incentive anymore to remain alive.
Like most prisoners, he would regain his will to live, but will was rarely enough to overcome their captors' commitment to kill them all. Inhuman conditions were the rule, beginning with barracks in which 500 were crammed, where no more than 75 could possibly have hoped to survive. 3-tier
barracks. We slept 3 people per bunk. So there were 9 people. The worst barrack, the worst bunk was the bottom one because they took everything from all the incontinence and diarrhea and everything that came from the top 2 tiers. They were the receivers of all the dignities overnight. But we slept without blankets. We were given blankets. We were assigned blankets initially. It was so brutally cold that we took those blankets, most of us, and tore them up and made vests out of them. And we could not show those vests because we would have been brutalized by the Germans or even murdered. We took those vests under our shirts. And some of us used paper bags from cements where we worked in factories and made vests out of them to survive.
Each morning, Murray helped to remove a dozen or more corpses from the barracks. Then the night's survivors lined up for their guards to decide who could still work and who instead would be murdered.
They didn't count us. They knew that we could not escape. But the roll call, the purpose of the roll call was to cull the sick and the emaciated and those who are incapable of working. And they told them they were going to the hospital. Well, the hospital was a euphemism for the gas chambers. I was picked no less than 10, 12 times to go to the hospital because I was too weak and too emaciated, and I slipped back to the line because I knew what a hospital meant. My cousin, I had a cousin with me there, his name was Sam Green, and he volunteered to go, quote, to the hospital, and I said to him, Sam, do you realize that this is not a hospital you're going to? Do you realize where you're going and what you're doing? And he said something to me again that haunts me still. And my Hungarian name was Maurice. And it says, Maurice, I know where I'm going. I will only suffer for 10 or 15 minutes, but you'll suffer until you die an undignified death from starvation. He says, who is better off, you or I?
For the slaves of Auschwitz, death was usually gradual, horrible, and inevitable. Murray's body became skeletal as he carried 50-pound cement sacks for 14 hours each day. And acts of cruelty or murder could come at any minute.
I'll never forget, a sergeant came over to me when I was in Auschwitz, and it's the only time I was threatened with my life. He comes over to me and he says, Junge, was hast du aufgefressen, dass du hier bist? I violated the rule of answering. I said, gar nicht. And he slapped me so hard that a thrust knocked me probably about 20 feet from him. I was blind, bloodshot and blind to one eye and deaf on my ear probably for weeks on my left side.
Diseases like typhus, dysentery, and cholera killed thousands, though the biggest killer of prisoners was unrelenting starvation.
Hunger assaults your mind and the body until it becomes delirious. All you do is you hallucinate about food. It was impossible to survive on what they fed us. We would give them a cup of coffee and a slice of bread in the morning, nothing at noontime, and at night a cup of foul-tasting potato soup. This was roughly 150 to 180 calories a day. The difference between those who survived and those who perished had a great deal to do with a mindset. There has to be an innate gift. If you believe in God, it may be a God-given gift. But it's a gift that I had to fight for life. And I fought for life every inch of the way, every moment of the day. I knew that I wanted to live. I knew that I wanted to survive. I knew that I was the only one in my family who survived at that point.
Deprivations at Auschwitz spared no one. So despite being a young teenager, Murray says he rarely got special considerations from his fellow prisoners.
You will probably hear different stories from different people, but my memory and my impression was that with few exceptions, we all became animalistic. We were all fighting for survival, and we became desensitized about each other.
By early 1945, Russian soldiers were at the gates of Auschwitz. Lacking time to kill and dispose of their bodies, the Nazis elected to march thousands of prisoners, including Murray Lynn, hundreds of miles to camps in Germany. Over the course of 10 brutal cold days, Murray fought to put one foot in front of another as the hateful Nazis committed murder all around him.
When I remember when we were marching on the death march, when the guards clobbered the sick people to death because they didn't want to waste a bullet on them. We knew that if we could just survive this terrible ordeal, that ultimately we would be liberated, but we didn't know how long it's going to take. We heard the planes flying above us. We knew that it's close, but we didn't know if we can survive long enough to see the daylight. It was an abyss of the worst kind. When I was liberated, I weighed roughly 60, 62 pounds, something like that. I was semi-comatose condition. I could not walk. My mind was barely functioning, and I was taken to the hospital, and I was fed intravenously for 2 weeks, which I was lucky because those of us who ate, who had access to too much food, died. Hundreds of them died because they overate. Their bodies could not absorb the food.
As soon as he could walk, Murray joined Europe's massive refugee population. He managed to stay alive for the months it took him to walk back to what had been his Hungarian home.
This is the same path that I took home roughly 15 months later, where an orchestrated gang of people were lining up the street, taunting us. Here I'm walking home on a dark evening by myself, with nothing in my hands. And what is cascading through my mind is, what am I going to do next if no one is home? What am I going to do if somebody is home? And when I finally got to our home, I knocked on a door, and a stranger opened the door, a hostile stranger. And he shouts at me, he said, "I thought you were all dead." I didn't remember him, but he knew me. And instinctively, I said to him, "I'm the ghost."
The Holocaust, Murray discovered, had made ghosts of virtually every Jew but himself. And he had no protection from hostile townspeople. Plus, now he had a new enemy, Stalinist communism, that was sweeping into Hungary and elsewhere and often arresting Holocaust survivors. Meanwhile, many Jews had decided to board ships for Israel, despite the inevitability of a war with its Arab neighbors. Murray, however, went to Ireland when a Jewish benefactor offered to transport him and other Jewish orphans for schooling in an old castle there. Less than a year later, the Irish government expelled them all for being Jewish.
Some of us would have stayed in Ireland. There were 2 or 3 families that wanted to adopt me in Ireland, Jewish families. I was a good-looking kid, and I was a charismatic kid, more so than I was now. I was full of spirit. And I had 2 or 3 offers to be adopted by wealthy families. They wouldn't let me stay.
5 decades later, Murray would return to Ireland with his best friend from his castle stay. the government extended them an apology for having forced the Jewish orphans to find another home in another country. That home for Murray turned out to be the United States, which welcomed him in 1949. Now, by almost any measure, he has achieved enormous success, by any measure but his own.
I'm happy with my children's success. I'm happy with my wife, my positions in life, but I'm not happy with myself. There's a big difference. Because material things don't mean, I'm not a ostentatious guy. I'm not a grandstander. I'm not a guy that has to do something to impress people. That's against my nature, against my personality. So these things mean less to me than the ordinary person. This is why I said I never made it to the finish line. Because of the personal void in my life. Not family void, but my void as a result of losing my parents young, of not having the love of my parents, not having the embrace, not having the security of my parents, not knowing how my life would have ended had this monster not intervened in our lives. This is why I have a void, and this is why I will always feel to the very end that I never made it to the finish line. My circle is not complete in that respect.
A few years ago, Murray Lynn returned with family members to Auschwitz, where he read a deeply personal letter composed to his mother. Here's a small excerpt.
Mom, this vile and dehumanizing kingdom of genocide is now a historical bulwark against future barbarians. We are united in our resolve to never let that happen again. Your martyrdom was not in vain. We have solemnly pledged to never let the world forget our suffering, nor the abysmal fall of humanity.
That legacy continues to provide us lessons and warnings. One came in the spring of 2010, when the sign at the Auschwitz gate was stolen by Polish neo-Nazis. And the day after their visit to the extermination camp, the spirit of the Lynn family was terribly wounded back in his native Hungary.
As we are walking the streets in Budapest, a car pulls over next to us and a young man jumps out of the car. He must have been in the early 20s, and raises his arm and it says, "Heil Hitler," and jumps back in the car. And my daughter was with me at that time. And I said to my daughter many times when she was young, don't forget who you are, because if you do, someday someone is going to remind you.
To remind you, in the end, that's what Holocaust survivors like Murray Lynn say they feel compelled to do. To remind you that hatred, even in its most vicious and diabolical forms, takes no holiday. We must, they say, keep watch both on the world and on ourselves.
We must fight for a better world than the world of our childhood. And we must never give up.
You know that what still tears me up more than anything else over the years, I still break down with welling tears in my eyes, is when my mom was raped. There is nothing that tears me up anymore. The memories that so deeply etched in my psyche. And by the way, I might mention this to you, my mom was a Hungarian beauty queen. She was crowned as a Hungarian beauty queen, you could tell, if you remember, when she was 19 and a half. Crowned as a Hungarian beauty queen, she was 19 and a half. 60 years later, she was murdered in Auschwitz. So that's how fast life moved in our country, Hungary. But let me just and you know, people often ask me, is it possible for you to forget these things? Can you forget it and forgive? I says, forgive yes, but forget no. I'm a forgiving person because I often tell my children and my friends that hatred and anger is a pathology of the mind. You can't live with that and move forward because it paralyzes you. It has a very, very negative impact on your life. So I've learned that in my younger years to be forgiving, but not forget. It's so deeply etched in my memory that my wife still wakes me up on the average of 3, 4, 5 times a year, screaming in my dreams, having nightmares. Still, this has been so many years, 2, 3 generations later. So the impact is so deeply etched in your memory that you can't forget. But let me just make a couple of comments, then we'll have some time, hopefully, for questions. Can this happen again? This was a cautionary tale that you saw. Can this happen again? Oh, emphatic yes. The drumbeat of excitement and virulent anti-Semitism has largely shifted from the cradle of anti-Semitism in Europe to the Middle East, where bellicose hate mongers are blaming Jews for their self-inflicted ills. Bigotry and racism are a growing phenomenon. In Japan, where Jews have never lived, radical elements have recently destroyed 250 Anne Frank's diaries in the Tokyo libraries. They went to every Tokyo library, this happened just recently, pulled out all the Anne Frank's books. These are historical documents that children read in school and are taught about history. They took them out and destroyed them. This is not a place where they ever knew Jews, where the Jews ever lived, but this is how fast hatred spread throughout the world for unknown reasons. Historians cannot understand it, they cannot explain it, but it is a fact. Ethical meltdowns are rarely the work of a few rogue people. This is what is worth remembering. Ethical meltdowns are rarely the work of a few rogue people. They take their cues from the press and toxic leadership. And that's where it all comes from. One last thing let me mention to you. You know, there's a question mark always, how many Jews really were killed? Auschwitz, where I was, is just one of about 30 death camps. But I clipped this out from the New York Times about a year or 2 ago, and it's worth repeating this to you so you would understand. I know all of you are very caring about Jewish history. A German soldier who spoke German was invited to speak, was invited to the Nuremberg trials where they were trying the murderers to be an interpreter from English to German. And this gentleman's name, who was an interpreter, was, what's his name here again? Sonnenberg. He was a German soldier of Jewish heritage who left Germany during the 30s, and he spoke perfect German. So he was one of many interpreters from. So one of the guys that was in the Nuremberg trial was Rudolf Hoss, H-O-S-S, and he asked Rudolf Hoss in German, and this is the question that he asked him. Sonnenberg was the first man to interrogate Rudolf Hoss, not to be confused with Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy. The former commander, Rudolf Hess, was the commander of the Auschwitz death camp. The former commander of the Auschwitz, arrested by the British troops in 1946. The first thing I said to him, and this is what Sonnenberg said, Herr Hoss, is it true that you exterminated 3.5 million people in Auschwitz? Is it true that you exterminated? He looked at me and said, that is not true. It was only 2.5 million. Only 2.5 million. It's one camp. And this comes from the commander of Auschwitz. The rest died from starvation and epidemics. He did not dispute that 3.5 million were killed, but 2.5 million, he claims, died in the gas chambers, and the other million died from starvation and disease. And I'm going to stop at this. But I wanted to tell you and share with you again the horrors of this one camp, just one camp, and the survival of that left indelible marks on all of us who were in Auschwitz. But anyway, going back to you, I will be happy to answer you all questions, any questions. But in spite of all that, I remain throughout life a fairly positive guy, otherwise I couldn't have made it. Sir, if you don't mind, come a little closer. I have a hearing issue.
Okay.
And so I'm not being difficult. I wouldn't hear you that far gone, but I'm glad to answer any questions.
I want to, first of all, thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you.
I'm greatly moved by it.
Thank you.
We thank God for your survival so you could tell this story.
Thank you.
My question is, when was the first time, and forgive me for mentioning this name to you, that you heard the name Adolf Eichmann and his incredible capture and trial in the 1960s in Israel, which I know had a profound impact on the story you continue to tell?
Well, Adolf Eichmann was a very evil man. He was responsible for transporting all the Hungarian Jews, and he was a vicious man. But you know, they were great actors, those guys. They didn't let us know. They tried to have a human face, but they didn't. He was one of the most evil guys, and he claimed in Israel when he was on trial that he only followed orders. There was not a single guy who was among the most vicious murderers who accepted any personal responsibility. They all claimed that they followed orders and they had no choice. And that was a lot of garbage. You know, they could have they could have left the army, they could have fled, they could have done a lot of things to mitigate that disaster. But they were part of Hitler's killing troops. And they wanted to do that. They felt they were doing justice to the German Republic and Hitler in particular. But I don't know whether to answer your question or not. But he was a vicious, vicious guy, and he got what he deserved. He was among the few people that Israel caught and served them justice. Yeah. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
What happened to the man in the Nuremberg trial you just said that said he only killed 2.5 million? What was his, did he get, what did he do?
The question is what happened to Haas, who was a German commander, who was the commander of the concentration camp. He was executed. Yeah, he was executed. But can you imagine 1 million people dying? He claimed 2.5 were murdered in Auschwitz, 1 million dying of starvation disease. You saw on the film. Why? It was impossible to survive. And that was my friend who volunteered to go to the gas chamber. He didn't want to go that way. He was, in a way, smart. He said something else that didn't match in the film. He says, I can't take this anymore. He says, I had hope, but I lost it. I can't take this anymore. And he volunteered to go to the gas chamber at the age of 14. He knew the consequences.
I read an absolutely appalling book called Hitler's Willing Executioners of why the Christian nation, like Germany, happily helped slaughter so many people. And you look at how much anti-Semitism was in the Christian nation, Luther, all of it. Do you see, I came up with, the birth of Israel, and I guess since I became Pentecostal and evangelical, we're pro-Israel. But do you see in the American churches that any budding of that anti-Semitism, just because they're favoring, so many of them are just, oh, the Muslims are wonderful. The Muslims taught Hitler how to slaughter people. So do you think there's a real fear that our churches can turn out just like Germany, because you don't remember?
Well, by the way, I would highly recommend that you read that Willing Executioner.
Hitler's Willing Executioners.
And the author is a former priest.
I forget the name, but it's
yeah, I can't remember the name. He is read the book. Well, one of the most ironic things in life is that Germany, I have a fancy word for that. There's a jarring juxtaposition about the two Germans. And I'll answer your question in a moment. The jarring juxtaposition between the two Germanys. On one hand, there was a Germany who produced the Beethovens, the Wagners, the Schillers, the Goethes, and many outstanding musicians and scientists. They were the most cultural nation in the world. They were ahead of their time. They were the most educated people in Europe. On the other hand, you had a Germany that produced Hitler and Himmler and hundreds of other murderers. And no one could understand a relationship between a country that is so sophisticated and, above all, a God-fearing nation. All of Europe is a mostly Catholic country. And what is so frightening is that the Catholics, instead of treating us, as I said earlier, as soul brothers, as brothers of same heritage, they treated us as enemies, and there were so few of them. Just so few of them that came to our assistance. The church was silent. The Catholic Church was silent all over Europe. They said very little. And as Ambassador said, there are some churches who spoke up, but for the most part they didn't. Is this happening now in other countries, in other faiths? Yes. I think I don't want to say this in any vicious way, but much of that hatred is brewing and simmering in the Muslim nations in particular. And I don't have to tell you, those of you who went to Israel, the Jewish people are scared of the consequences, and they act in self-defense, and we're always evil. The problem is that they are given no credit for anything, and they're fighting an isolated war. The world has turned against them because they allegedly are not treating the Arabs right. And I'll give you, this, Arab served in the parliament, in the Israeli parliament, Tell me one Arab country where Jews serve on the parliament there in the Arab country. None. None. Tell me where Arabs are treated as equals, where they have the same rights as Jews. None. There's no Arab country. So there's an incredible bias against Jews, and the worst part is that the very left-wing countries, and particularly the Scandinavian countries like Norway and Sweden and Denmark, Israel cannot do anything right. They want to isolate them, they want to punish them, and it's a frightening phenomenon. We don't know what else we can do to add balance. Look, am I saying that Israel is doing everything right? No. I'm a realist. I say Israel needs to make some concessions to them. And the answer is always, well, even if they make concessions, they will still be indicted for wrongdoing. I says, maybe so. But at least you give the appearance that you're flexible. You cannot take an absolute attitude. You have to make some concessions to let the world know that you are trying. But they feel, the government feels, and I'm sure you know this, some of you have been to Israel, that no matter what they do, it's an out. They gave out the Gaza Strip, they thought this would bring peace, but it didn't. So they're frustrated people, they're scared, they're worried about their survival. It's an existential issue. It's really an existential issue. Arabs said this openly, over and over again, they will not recognize Israel in Palestine. You heard this, you read about it. So what are they to do? They are caught in a very difficult, uncompromising condition. Very tough. Yes, ma'am.
I just like to say, kind of as a remark to what the lady asked, there are many, many Christian denominations that believe in replacement theology. And I know you all have heard of that. And they don't believe that Israel has any plan and purpose, or has any place in the plan and purpose of God. So that's unfortunate.
They believe that now that the church has replaced the promises of God to Israel, that the promises to Israel now nullified, and the church gets it all, and we're not that.
Yeah.
They're talking replacement theology.
Well, some Jewish people think that that is true, but it doesn't matter. We need your support. We want your support. We urgently need it. So the world will know that it's not the Jews supporting the Jews, that there are other people outside Jewish people who are outside our faith who support the cause. So we desperately need your support. There's no question about it. Yes, ma'am.
How do you feel about God now?
That's a sort of a sensitive issue, ma'am. But I'm not avoiding it. I'll answer your question.
Get behind the
Most of us, yeah, let me get to it. The question is, which is I'm asked from time to time, our relationship to God. You know, it eroded over the years, particularly during the Auschwitz, a difficult period in our lives, but most of us have now lost hope. Many of us became agnostics and atheists after the war. I remember our people pleading for mercy and salvation, and no one came to our aid. We felt that we were abandoned by man and God. So the natural tendency was to, if he abandoned us, we'll abandon him. But as I often tell audiences, many of us are born-again Jews. I have had a difficult time reconnecting with God. I have to share this with you. I wouldn't tell this young children to whom I speak a lot, but to adults I feel I'm on safer ground. Not safe ground, but safer ground. I have a difficult time reconnecting with Him. It had a very, very serious impact, because it had a very serious impact on our lives for all these years. I'll just give you a little example. When I came to the States, I came here as a student from Ireland. I came here to New York where I lived for 6 years while I was going to college. I was afraid of policemen, just to show you the kind of mindset, what I had to go through. I was afraid of soldiers. I had to take a subway to college. I couldn't take a subway to college because the train reminded me of the cattle cars. I broke out in cold sweats. So after a few weeks, I stopped taking the subway. I had to take the bus to college. This went on for years. I wouldn't wear anything yellow because it reminded me of a yellow star. Wouldn't wear a sweater, wouldn't wear a tie, wouldn't wear anything that has any yellow in it. I was afraid of my own shadow. I lost a lot of self-confidence because when you're being told as a child how bad you are as a Jew, ultimately it has an incredible impact on your life. You know, as resilient as you are mentally and physically, when you are told over and over again, it affects your self-confidence. And I'm still a very, very insecure guy, and it goes back a lot to my background. And even today, when I'm in a car and I pass, you know, they have those orange utility poles on the side of the street. Every time I see one of those poles, I get a cold chill on my back. You know why? Because the orange and black band of Germany, of the German soldiers. It goes to show you how deeply embedded, how much we still suffer at this stage in my life. Instead of having peace, I'm constantly reminded. Making this film was one of the most difficult decisions for me. Very emotional, very tough, very painful. Because I didn't want to go through this again. But I felt it was important for you to know and for you to understand. So I did this as a public service, and Ireland, where I lived, they saw it. They heard of my film, and I gave them one, but we don't allow it to be distributed, to be sold. This is used only for public, for educational purposes. But it left very deep scars in our lives, and also my family. And let me give you an example. When my children were young, when they were first and second and third grader, my children would ask me, "Dad, why is it that we don't have grandparents like our friends? Why is it that we don't have uncles and aunts and cousins like all our friends? What are you going to tell a first and second and third grader?" So they were also unwitting victims of our tragedy. They grew up without relatives, totally. And they feel it today. They're adults in the 50s now. So it left very deep scars in our lives. You know, we knew, we were walking, we were a walking dead every day. We didn't know whether we were going to die by bullet in a gas chamber or die of starvation. But those of us who were still there, were fighters, and we looked forward to a better day. That is basically what we said. Let me tell you about two types of mindsets in a concentration camp that is very important to know. Those who lived in the past and felt sorry for themselves and thought about how good life was and what they had that they didn't have, and they didn't last very long. But those who lived for the day and those who fought for the future had a better chance of survival. Those of us who survived had the faith in ourselves, had the fight, the resilience. This is very important, the resilience. And we said that we knew that it was just a matter of weeks, maybe months, but we knew if we can last long enough, as I mentioned in film, to see the daylight, that we're ultimately going to make it. We knew we were close. And that was the biggest survival blanket of survival skills that we had is look to the future. Those who dwelled on the past didn't make it. So resilience was very, very important. Mental resilience. Physically, we had no control over our physical body because it just went the natural course. We were not fed, and our bodies were going downhill all the time. So we had no control over that, but we had some control left over our mindset. And those with a positive mindset, it was tough to be positive when you don't know whether you're going to live from moment to moment. But those of us who could cope with that survived. I hope I answered your question.
When you thought of the future, though, was that you would make a better day, a better world, that you would, it wasn't for future for revenge, or that you would, was it having to think you can make the world different, that you would not let this happen again? Because it seems to me, I've lived for, it seems like the tendency would be to live for the future to get even. Or
yeah, well, you know, I have worked for many years in the last 10, 12 years to make the world a better world by talking about it. I was in Dublin, Ireland on a speaking engagement last year and spoke in many parts of the country. And to do this, ma'am, I do this to make this a better world. For me, it's very, very difficult for me to talk about the past. And I suppose that most of my fellow survivors go through the same thing. We don't like to do it. It's painful to do it. It's traumatic to do it. But we do it because we feel it's a community service, and we have to do it to save future generations from catastrophes like the gentleman mentioned.
I'm going to start with praying the Aaronic blessing over Murray in Hebrew and in English. Yivarechecha Adonai ve'ishmerecha, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chunecha, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasamcha shalom. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord lift up his face upon you and shine his grace upon you. May the Lord lift up the face of his countenance upon you and give you his peace. Amen.
Thank you so much. This was very moving. Thank you.